Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, my friend, for many years. I find it interesting that she didn't even want to try, Congresswoman Crockett, to ask any questions, because she certainly did not condemn her leader, Hakeem Jeffries, for taking money from Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein was convicted. And I will be brief to give you your time, Congressman. This is what she didn't want to talk about. Texas, from Cuba, convicted, homicide, arson, weapon offense.
Convicted.
You know,
so what we
Estrada,
talking about? Convict
Texas,
some of these perpetrators
homicide.
that rape these women.
I'm the logs, and I am the logs. The dealing with my kids. You're refusing, even if not with a...
They are here.
In a hearing room that has witnessed decades of partisan maneuvering and procedural choreography, Jasmine Crockett shifted the tone of the afternoon from routine oversight to direct moral confrontation. And she did so with a precision that forced the Attorney General of the United States into a silence few had ever seen from her. The setting was House Judiciary Committee Room 2141, February 12, 2026, at 4:17 p.m., and the afternoon light stretching across the chamber gave the moment a gravity that matched what was about to unfold. For hours, the hearing had drifted through predictable territory, with questions about departmental restructuring, budget allocations, and internal policy adjustments that allowed Attorney General Pam Bondi to remain controlled, measured, and technically compliant without ever yielding substantive ground. Pam Bondi had answered with the calm authority of a seasoned prosecutor, invoking prosecutorial discretion, institutional integrity, and ongoing review in language that was legally careful and strategically narrow. Crockett, however, had not been preparing to engage in incremental questioning. She had been observing patterns, noting deflections, and waiting for the precise moment to collapse the structure of evasions that had protected the department's most sensitive decisions. When Crockett finally began, she did not waste time establishing collegiality or performing ritual courtesy, and that deviation from standard congressional decorum signaled that the exchange would not follow the usual script. She stated plainly that Pam Bondi's performance had demonstrated contempt for both the committee and the American people, framing the issue not as a policy disagreement, but as a breach of institutional trust. Rather than immediately introducing documents, Crockett first established a moral baseline through a series of direct questions to Representative Ballant, asking whether raping children was wrong, whether protecting predators was wrong, and whether using the Department of Justice to conceal evidence of child abuse was wrong. Each answer was immediate and unequivocal, and the cumulative effect was to define the ethical terrain before Pam Bondi could retreat into technicalities. By the time Crockett turned back toward the witness table, the contrast had been drawn between basic moral clarity and what she was about to argue was systemic moral failure within the department. Crockett then moved to documented figures, citing DOJ records, showing that $47 million had been spent that year prosecuting journalists and whistleblowers, while prosecutions of child sex trafficking cases had declined by 34% compared to the previous year. The numbers were not presented as abstract budgetary data, but as evidence of priorities, and Crockett's argument was that resource allocation reflects institutional intent more honestly than press statements ever could. She referenced the arrest of investigative journalist Sarah Chen, whose prosecution for publishing leaked documents about Jeffrey Epstein's connections to current administration officials had cost taxpayers $2.3 million in prosecutorial resources. In contrast, she produced an internal DOJ memorandum, indicating that 7 child exploitation cases had been declined, because the subjects maintained significant political connections requiring careful consideration. The phrase significant political connections was read verbatim, and it carried implications that extended beyond any single case to suggest a hierarchy of accountability based not on the severity of alleged crimes, but on proximity to power. Having established what she characterized as a pattern of misaligned priorities, Crockett addressed the central issue that had hovered over the hearing without being directly confronted, namely Donald Trump's documented relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. She cited recently released FBI files, indicating that Trump appeared in Epstein's records more than any other individual, with 73 separate documented interactions between 1993 and 2019, including flight logs, phone records, visitor entries, and financial transactions. The scope and duration of the association were emphasized to underscore that this was not an incidental overlap, but a sustained connection spanning decades. Pam Bondi's breathing, captured faintly but audibly through the microphone, became a subtle indicator that the exchange had moved beyond prepared talking points into territory that carried personal and political consequences. Crockett then introduced FBI interview summary witness designation E47, dated March 15, 2023, and read its contents regarding observations of Trump at Epstein's Palm Beach residence, between 2001 and 2007, including an account of Epstein introducing Trump to a girl who appeared to be approximately 16 years old. When Crockett asked why this testimony had not been followed up on during the 3 years it had been in FBI files, Pam Bondi responded by invoking the familiar language of ongoing investigations and prosecutorial integrity, declining to comment on sealed materials. Crockett countered not by speculating, but by introducing a January 18, 2026 memorandum from Pam Bondi's own Deputy Attorney General, stating that all Epstein-related investigations involving current administration officials were to be placed on administrative hold pending further review, with no new investigative actions authorized without the Attorney General's personal approval. The implication was not mere inaction, but affirmative intervention, and Crockett framed it as a decision to halt momentum in cases that implicated powerful figures. The administrative hold directive, read into the record, suggested a chain of command that flowed directly from Pam Bondi's office, undermining any argument that investigative inertia was incidental or bureaucratic. Pam Bondi remained restrained in demeanor, but her earlier confidence had given way to shorter answers and a narrowing range of defensible explanations. Crockett proceeded to reference an internal DOJ email chain from February 2026, in which Pam Bondi's chief of staff recommended reclassifying Trump-Epstein materials at the highest levels to prevent congressional access, allegedly at the Attorney General's request. By placing that communication alongside the administrative hold directive, Crockett constructed a narrative of deliberate containment, arguing that classification and delay were being used as tools to manage exposure rather than to protect investigative integrity. She stated that Pam Bondi had sworn an oath to uphold justice without regard to person or position, and asserted that her actions reflected loyalty to an individual rather than to the Constitution. For the first time in the exchange, Pam Bondi offered no substantive rebuttal beyond reiterating procedural constraints, and the absence of a detailed counter-argument was as consequential as any admission could have been. Crockett then spoke directly about the perception among survivors of child abuse, arguing that when investigations stall and materials are shielded, it signals that power can insulate alleged wrongdoing from scrutiny. When Crockett concluded by stating that Pam Bondi would be remembered as the Attorney General who chose loyalty to power over loyalty to justice, and institutional preservation over constitutional duty, she framed the moment as one that would extend beyond the news cycle into historical judgment. She yielded her time but declared that she would not yield in her determination to secure accountability for survivors, reinforcing that the exchange was not an isolated confrontation, but part of a larger struggle over institutional credibility. Within minutes, clips circulated widely, and legal commentators debated not the tone but the documentary substance of what had been read into the record. The phrase "protecting predators" trended across platforms, reflecting how the exchange had distilled complex procedural disputes into a stark moral question. What distinguished the confrontation was not rhetorical flourish, but the reliance on internal documents, memos, and recorded directives that originated from the department itself. In 7 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had forced a reckoning, not through speculation, but through the government's own paper trail. The significance of what had just occurred did not rest solely on the sharpness of Crockett's questioning, but on the structural argument she was building in real time. An argument that suggested the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi had not merely exercised discretion, but had redefined the boundaries of accountability based on political alignment. In Washington, discretion is often defended as a necessary component of prosecutorial judgment, yet Crockett's framing insisted that discretion becomes corruption when it is applied asymmetrically. The $47 million spent pursuing journalists and whistleblowers was not in her telling an abstract budgetary choice, but a signal that exposure of wrongdoing had been recast as a greater threat than wrongdoing itself. The 34% decline in child sex trafficking prosecutions was positioned not as a fluctuation, but as evidence that the department's moral compass had shifted. By placing these statistics side by side, Crockett forced the audience to confront an uncomfortable arithmetic, in which institutional energy appeared to be redirected away from protecting vulnerable victims and toward containing reputational risk. Pam Bondi attempted to situate her decisions within the familiar language of prioritization, arguing that resource allocation must account for case complexity and evidentiary thresholds, but Crockett's reply suggested that complexity cannot justify selective paralysis. She emphasized that the 7 child exploitation cases referenced in the internal memorandum had not been rejected for lack of evidence, but for the presence of significant political connections, a phrase that transformed the declination into a policy statement about whose interests merited caution. In legal practice, careful consideration is a neutral term, yet within the context Crockett provided, it carried the implication that political stature had become a mitigating factor in the pursuit of justice. The exchange exposed a tension between formal legality and substantive fairness, a tension that often defines institutional controversies, but rarely surfaces so starkly in open hearing. Crockett did not accuse Pam Bondi of inventing new laws, she accused her of weaponizing existing procedures to insulate the powerful from scrutiny. The distinction was crucial because it reframed the debate from one of partisan hostility to one of constitutional principle. As the discussion returned to the documented interactions between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, Crockett underscored that 73 recorded instances over nearly 3 decades could not reasonably be dismissed as incidental contact. She clarified that flight logs, phone records and visitor entries do not in themselves establish criminal liability, yet they do establish a factual basis for further inquiry when combined with witness testimony. The FBI interview summary from witness designation E47, dated March 15, 2023, was not introduced as proof of guilt, but as a lead requiring investigative diligence. Crockett's question was not why had Trump been convicted, but why had documented testimony not been pursued with urgency. Pam Bondi reiterated that ongoing investigations could not be discussed publicly, but Crockett's subsequent citation of the January 18, 2026 administrative hold directive complicated the defense. If investigations were ongoing, Crockett implied, why had they been placed on hold pending further review with personal approval required from the Attorney General? The administrative hold became the focal point of the exchange because it suggested centralized control over investigative momentum, and Crockett argued that such centralization is particularly troubling when the subject of inquiry is aligned with the executive branch. She noted that the directive applied specifically to Epstein-related investigations involving current administration officials, narrowing its scope in a way that implied protective intent rather than procedural uniformity. Pam Bondi responded that administrative holds are sometimes necessary to ensure consistency across divisions, yet Crockett countered that consistency cannot be achieved by halting action indefinitely. In constitutional governance, independence of investigation is not a symbolic ideal, but a structural safeguard designed to prevent precisely the kind of entanglement Crockett was alleging. By invoking Pam Bondi's oath to uphold justice without regard to person or position, Crockett elevated the argument beyond personal rivalry to the level of constitutional duty. The room's stillness reflected an understanding that this was no longer about messaging, but about the legitimacy of federal law enforcement itself. When Crockett introduced the February 2026 internal email chain recommending reclassification of Trump-Epstein materials at the highest levels to prevent congressional access, she framed classification not as a security measure, but as a barrier to oversight. Classification in itself is lawful and often necessary, yet Crockett's argument was that its strategic timing and target suggested an effort to control narrative, rather than protect national security. She emphasized that congressional access to investigative materials is not a courtesy extended at the discretion of the executive, but a component of the separation of powers. Pam Bondi maintained that classification decisions are guided by legal standards and intelligence assessments, but Crockett pointed to the explicit language in the email referencing congressional access as evidence of intent. The debate thus shifted from the substance of Trump's interactions with Epstein to the architecture of information control within the department. In that shift, Crockett demonstrated that even absent a criminal charge, the manipulation of investigative transparency can constitute a breach of institutional ethics. The cumulative impact of Crockett's presentation lay in the coherence of the narrative she assembled from disparate documents, each of which on its own might have been dismissed as procedural nuance. The $47 million expenditure on journalist prosecutions, the 34% decline in child sex trafficking cases, the declined prosecutions citing political connections, the 73 documented interactions, the E47 witness summary, the administrative hold directive, and the reclassification email formed a sequence that pointed toward a systemic pattern. Crockett did not rely on conjecture or anonymous sources, she relied on internal records and dated memoranda that originated within the department. Pam Bondi's silence during key portions of the exchange was not an admission of wrongdoing, yet it underscored the difficulty of reconciling those records with the department's stated mission. In political hearings, witnesses often survive by deflecting into abstractions, but Crockett's insistence on documentary specificity narrowed the available escape routes. The tension in the room was not theatrical but institutional, rooted in the recognition that oversight had penetrated beyond surface explanations. As the hearing moved forward, members of both parties appeared aware that the exchange would reverberate beyond the chamber, not because of rhetorical drama, but because of the implications for public trust. Crockett's closing remarks reiterated that survivors of child abuse measure justice not by press conferences, but by the consistency with which investigations are pursued. She argued that when investigative leads involving powerful figures are paused or reclassified, the message conveyed to victims is that hierarchy outweighs harm. Pam Bondi, who had built her career on prosecuting criminals and projecting toughness, now faced the perception that her toughness had become selective. The symbolism of the moment was stark. The nation's top law enforcement official confronting a record read aloud from her own department's files. In that confrontation, the broader question emerged of whether institutions can remain credible when their internal mechanisms appear to privilege proximity to power. The immediate aftermath amplified the gravity of what had transpired, as legal analysts dissected not the tone of Crockett's remarks, but the contents of the memoranda she cited. Commentators debated whether administrative holds are inherently suspect or context-dependent. Yet few disputed that the language of significant political connections was difficult to defend publicly. Survivors' advocacy organizations focused on the decline in trafficking prosecutions, framing it as evidence that enforcement priorities had shifted in ways that merited explanation. Pam Bondi's office issued statements reiterating its commitment to prosecutorial integrity, but those statements did not directly refute the existence of the directives Crockett had read into the record. In 7 minutes of questioning, the narrative surrounding the department's handling of Epstein-related investigations had changed from opaque management to contested accountability. The confrontation did not resolve the legal questions at stake, but it ensured that they could no longer be treated as peripheral or hypothetical. What distinguished this confrontation from countless prior oversight exchanges was not merely the substance of the documents, but the sequencing with which Crockett deployed them, constructing an argument that moved from moral premise to statistical evidence, to administrative action, and finally to institutional consequence. By beginning with universally accepted moral standards, and then anchoring her case in internal memoranda, she avoided the appearance of partisan accusation, and instead framed the matter as a question of structural integrity within the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi. The insistence on reading verbatim language from official documents prevented the debate from devolving into interpretive speculation, forcing attention onto the department's own recorded decisions. Pam Bondi's responses, grounded in procedural caution, could not easily negate the existence of those decisions, and that asymmetry created the visible tension in the chamber. The administrative hold directive in particular became emblematic of the broader concern that investigative momentum had been subordinated to political calculation. Crockett returned repeatedly to the idea that the department's legitimacy depends not only on what it prosecutes, but on what it declines to prosecute, and she emphasized that declinations accompanied by references to significant political connections invite public skepticism. The 7 child exploitation cases cited earlier were not introduced as abstract files, but as concrete instances in which victims' grievances had been weighed against the reputational sensitivities of the accused. Crockett asserted that such weighing is incompatible with the oath to administer justice without regard to person or position, an oath that Pam Bondi herself had sworn upon confirmation. In Washington, where proximity to power often affords insulation, the suggestion that insulation had become policy was especially damaging. Pam Bondi attempted to contextualize the declines within evidentiary thresholds and interagency coordination, but Crockett maintained that political connections are not evidentiary deficiencies, and should not influence prosecutorial calculus. The debate thus centered not on the legality of holds or classification, but on the moral valence of their application. As discussion returned to the 73 documented interactions between Trump and Epstein, Crockett reiterated that repeated contact over decades necessitates rigorous inquiry, particularly when accompanied by sworn testimony from witness designation E47. She clarified again that documentation of association is not equivalent to proof of criminal conduct, yet she underscored that investigative diligence requires pursuing credible leads, regardless of the subject's political standing. The E47 summary described observed interactions in Palm Beach between 2001 and 2007, including the introduction of a minor who appeared to be approximately 16 years old, and Crockett argued that the gravity of such an account demanded sustained attention rather than administrative suspension. Pam Bondi's reliance on the phrase ongoing investigations appeared increasingly strained in light of the January 18 directive, placing those investigations on hold pending further review. The distinction between an ongoing case and a paused case became central, because a pause without defined parameters can function as indefinite postponement. Crockett suggested that indefinite postponement, when applied to politically sensitive subjects, amounts to quiet abandonment. The February 2026 email chain recommending reclassification of Trump-Epstein materials at the highest levels further complicated Pam Bondi's defense, because it explicitly referenced preventing congressional access, raising concerns about the balance of powers. Classification systems exist to protect national security and sensitive sources, yet Crockett contended that invoking classification to limit oversight crosses from protection into obstruction. She emphasized that congressional oversight is not antagonistic by definition, but a constitutional mechanism intended to preserve transparency and accountability. When executive branch officials restrict access to investigative materials without clear security justification, they risk undermining the very checks that sustain democratic governance. Pam Bondi insisted that classification decisions adhere to established protocols, but Crockett countered that the timing and wording of the email indicated a defensive posture toward legislative scrutiny. The exchange revealed how procedural mechanisms, neutral in isolation, can appear suspect when aligned with politically consequential subjects. Beyond the documents themselves, Crockett articulated a broader critique of institutional culture, arguing that the department's pursuit of journalists, such as Sarah Chen, demonstrated an intolerance for exposure that contrasted sharply with caution toward well-connected figures. The allocation of $2.3 million in prosecutorial resources to Chen's case symbolized, in Crockett's framing, a willingness to expend substantial effort against those who publicize uncomfortable information. When juxtaposed with the 34% decline in trafficking prosecutions, the image that emerged was one of inverted priorities. Pam Bondi maintained that whistleblower prosecutions served the rule of law by protecting classified information, yet Crockett asserted that the optics of aggressive pursuit in one domain and hesitation in another erode public confidence. In the calculus of public trust, consistency is paramount, and apparent inconsistency invites suspicion. The hearing room absorbed that tension as members considered not only the facts presented but the broader narrative implications. Crockett also addressed the psychological dimension of justice, noting that survivors of abuse gauge governmental commitment by the steadiness with which cases are pursued, not by assurances of review, administrative holds and reclassification decisions. While legally defensible in some contexts can signal to victims that their experiences are subordinate to institutional risk management. She argued that when allegations involve individuals at the apex of political power, the department's obligation to demonstrate impartiality intensifies rather than diminishes. Pam Bondi's silence at critical junctures reinforced the perception that procedural defenses were insufficient to dispel the pattern Crockett had outlined. The atmosphere in the chamber was less combative than contemplative as the implications extended beyond partisan rivalry to the credibility of federal enforcement itself. In that silence, the weight of constitutional responsibility became palpable. As the exchange concluded, the narrative that had unfolded in 7 minutes began to reverberate across media platforms, with analysts parsing the language of the memoranda and the administrative hold directive. Legal scholars debated whether the directive constituted routine coordination or extraordinary intervention, yet the specificity of its scope, Epstein-related investigations involving current administration officials, made it difficult to characterize generic oversight. Crockett's final assertion that Pam Bondi would be remembered for choosing loyalty to power over loyalty to justice resonated not as rhetorical flourish, but as a summation of the documentary record she had presented. Pam Bondi's office reiterated commitments to integrity and ongoing review, but those reiterations did not negate the existence of the cited directives. The larger question that lingered was whether institutional mechanisms designed for prudence had been repurposed for protection. In a constitutional system predicated on equal accountability, even the appearance of selective restraint can corrode legitimacy. The confrontation did not produce immediate legal consequences, nor did it resolve the factual disputes surrounding Trump's association with Epstein, yet it reframed the public conversation about how those disputes were being handled. Crockett's approach demonstrated that oversight can pierce bureaucratic opacity when anchored in internal documentation rather than external accusation. The cumulative force of the $47 million expenditure on journalist prosecutions, the 34% decline in trafficking cases, the declined prosecutions citing political connections, the 73 documented interactions, the E47 testimony, the administrative hold, and the reclassification email established a chain of reasoning that challenged the department's narrative of impartiality under Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi's inability to dismantle that chain in real time underscored the power of structured oversight. In the aftermath, the focus shifted from whether allegations would result in charges to whether the investigative process itself had been compromised. That shift may ultimately prove more consequential than any individual case outcome, because it speaks to the durability of trust in the institutions tasked with enforcing the law. As the hearing resumed its formal structure after Crockett yielded her time, the atmosphere in room 2141 did not revert to routine oversight. It remained charged with the recognition that a line had been drawn between institutional procedure and institutional purpose. The members who followed did not immediately replicate Crockett's intensity, yet her documentation lingered in the air as an unaddressed framework through which subsequent answers would be judged. Pam Bondi returned to the language of review, compliance and departmental protocol, but the earlier citations of the January 18th administrative hold and the February reclassification email had altered the interpretive context. No longer were those mechanisms neutral bureaucratic tools, they had been situated within a narrative of selective caution and political sensitivity. Even absent an explicit admission, the juxtaposition of directives, statistics and witness testimony had compelled observers to question whether enforcement priorities had been recalibrated to minimize exposure rather than maximize accountability. The broader implication of Crockett's questioning lay in the tension between executive discretion and legislative oversight, a tension that has defined the American system since its inception. Administrative holds, classification authority, and prosecutorial prioritization are lawful instruments within the executive branch, yet their legitimacy depends on demonstrable neutrality. Crockett's argument was that neutrality erodes when decisions disproportionately shield those aligned with power, while imposing aggressive scrutiny on those who challenge it. The $47 million expended on journalist and whistleblower prosecutions was not alleged to be unlawful. It was alleged to reflect a value hierarchy inconsistent with the department's professed mission under Pam Bondi. Similarly, the 34% decline in child sex trafficking prosecutions was not presented as evidence of malice, but as evidence of misalignment. When paired with memoranda referencing significant political connections and directives, placing investigations on hold, those figures ceased to appear coincidental. The constitutional question raised was not whether the department had authority to act, but whether it had exercised that authority with impartial fidelity. Observers noted that Pam Bondi's responses remained confined to procedural justifications, avoiding direct engagement with the optics of the pattern Crockett described. By emphasizing ongoing review and prosecutorial integrity, Pam Bondi sought to preserve institutional insulation from public inference. Yet Crockett's structured presentation had already reframed the issue from isolated procedural acts to cumulative institutional behavior. The 73 documented interactions between Trump and Epstein, while not conclusive in themselves, had been situated alongside witness designation E47's testimony to establish investigatory urgency. The administrative hold directive limited specifically to Epstein-related investigations involving current administration officials, appeared less like routine synchronization, and more like strategic containment. The February email recommending highest-level classification to prevent congressional access reinforced the perception that information management had become central to departmental strategy under Pam Bondi. The exchange also illuminated the fragile boundary between loyalty and duty in executive leadership. Pam Bondi's oath to uphold justice without regard to person or position was not a ceremonial phrase. It was a constitutional commitment designed to restrain the very impulses Crockett alleged were at work. Loyalty to the executive branch is expected within hierarchical governance, yet loyalty cannot supersede obligation to impartial enforcement. Crockett's assertion that the department had functioned as a personal law firm for a political figure was severe, but it was anchored in documented directives rather than rhetorical hyperbole. The hearing demonstrated how easily procedural discretion can be interpreted as favoritism when transparency is limited. Even if the department maintained that its decisions were legally justified, the appearance of selective caution toward politically connected individuals undermined public assurance. As news outlets dissected the hearing, attention focused not only on Crockett's tone, but on the internal language of the memoranda she read into the record. The phrase "significant political connections" became a focal point, emblematic of the broader concern that influence had entered prosecutorial calculus. Analysts debated whether administrative holds are commonly applied in politically sensitive investigations. Yet few could dispute that the explicit requirement of Attorney General personal approval concentrated decision-making in a way that amplified scrutiny. The reclassification recommendation, explicitly referencing prevention of congressional access, raised questions about the equilibrium between information security and legislative oversight. Survivors' advocacy groups highlighted the decline in trafficking prosecutions as evidence that enforcement intensity had shifted during a period of heightened public awareness about exploitation networks. Pam Bondi's office reiterated its dedication to protecting children and enforcing the law, but the reiterated assurances could not erase the documented sequence Crockett had assembled. Within legal circles,
The exchange was recognized as a case study in oversight methodology, demonstrating how disciplined reliance on internal documentation can transform a hearing from partisan spectacle into substantive examination. Crockett's strategy of beginning with moral clarity, progressing through statistical data, and culminating in administrative directives, provided a coherent narrative arc that was difficult to dismiss as rhetorical excess. Pam Bondi's restraint, while professionally consistent, inadvertently reinforced the gravity of the allegations because it left the documentary evidence largely uncontested in the moment. The 7-minute confrontation thus became emblematic of the power of structured questioning in a system designed to balance branches of government. It underscored that accountability does not always emerge from dramatic revelations, but from the careful alignment of existing records. In that alignment, the department's internal decisions were exposed to the same scrutiny it routinely applies to others. Crockett's final statement that she would not yield in her determination to secure justice for survivors signaled that the hearing was not an endpoint, but a catalyst. Oversight committees operate within defined temporal constraints, yet their influence extends through follow-up inquiries, document requests and public debate. The narrative constructed during those 7 minutes created a foundation for continued examination of how Epstein-related investigations were handled under Pam Bondi's leadership. Whether additional hearings would expand upon the administrative hold directive, or the classification decision remained uncertain, but the precedent had been set that such matters would not remain insulated from legislative inquiry. The larger implication for the department was that procedural opacity could no longer function as a shield against detailed scrutiny. In a constitutional republic, enforcement agencies derive authority from public confidence, and public confidence depends on demonstrable impartiality. Ultimately, the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Pam Bondi crystallized a central dilemma of contemporary governance: how to reconcile executive discretion with the demand for transparent accountability in cases involving powerful actors. Crockett did not allege a completed crime within that hearing. She alleged an obstruction of investigative momentum supported by documented directives. The distinction matters, because it shifts the focus from individual culpability to institutional behavior. Pam Bondi's tenure as Attorney General had been defined by prosecutorial assertiveness, yet in this context, assertiveness appeared unevenly distributed. The $47 million in journalist prosecutions, the 34% decline in trafficking cases, the declined prosecutions citing political connections, the 73 documented interactions, the E47 testimony, the administrative hold, and the reclassification email formed a cumulative record that demanded explanation beyond procedural language. Whether history would judge those decisions as prudent caution or protective maneuvering would depend on further disclosures and investigations. What was undeniable was that in 7 measured minutes, the architecture of a department's decision-making had been laid bare before the nation, and the question of whose interests that architecture ultimately served could no longer be deferred.